So this takes me to the next topic on our agenda, which is the speech by someone from the business. Mr. Schwämmlein, I introduced you already. You are a co-founder of Flix SE. You are co-CEO of Flix. I said already, you know both sides of competition. As an incumbent, as the competitor of an incumbent, we are very much looking forward to your speech. Mr. Schwämmlein, the floor is yours.
So thanks a lot. It's an honor to be here. It's also a bit mixed feelings. I think the company is only like 10 years old, and it feels strange that a lot of people know the company and my name in a room filled with antitrust and competition authorities, to be honest. And I mean, I had a couple of conversations and most started with, yeah, I heard of you, and a very interesting case. And I'm not sure if interesting is good or bad in that context, maybe a bit of both. But nevertheless, I'm happy to be here. Why? Because unlike many other companies, we are very involved in the topics you do in day-to-day work, because we were born out of deregulation, out of opening of a market, and we were born in a competitive field with a high relevance for politics. And initially, when I started Flix, that was about 10 years ago, it was born out of the liberalization of the bus market, so the ending of a monopoly which dated back from the 1930s, so almost 100 years of monopoly in long-distance transport in Germany. And that ended, and we discovered in the coalition contract. And this was something, meanwhile, I read the coalition contract out of a professional reason. Back then, it was out of interest of what's happening in the political sphere, but also in the market sphere, because we were looking for an opportunity to build a business, to use digitalization to create something new in an ideally old-fashioned market, because that enables innovation. And meanwhile, we are, and maybe quickly introduce, we are in around 40 countries in 4 continents. So we have grown to a very global company. That is because the market segment we cater for is relatively small in every market, even if it's like of kind of high profile because of public interest. Our markets are per definition relatively large in long distance, but our segment is relatively small. And what we are is, we are a digital-born company out of competition. And today, I want to talk about our learnings from the last 10 years of being in that market space, and how we see it for the future. Because the funny thing is, if you look back 20 years, almost everyone could have predicted how mobility will look like 10 years later. Not a lot of change happening. Today, if you ask people how mobility in 10 or 20 years will look like, it will be hard for them to exactly answer it. So I think we're in a decisive time of sustainability and technology, and we have to shape this future in a positive sense for the society and for the planet. And so therefore, I want to talk about 4 theses that we have out of the 10 years of learnings. One is, we have seen very small changes making a big impact, and that not necessarily the biggest companies win if the market is properly deregulated and there's fair competition. And on the other hand, there will be money required to drive the sustainability change out there and to reach our goals for this planet. But money has to be well spent, and it can only be spent one time, and therefore should be very focused and not necessarily into operators, and but more on market conditions. And then another aspect, and that's obviously not news to you, but something that we learned the hard way, that it's not always the very obvious, visible market closures or barriers that you see. Some markets are de jure deregulated, but de facto not approachable. And I think that's a big challenge, because the big flagship things, they mostly happened, but there are a lot of small things of hard daily work, which we have to fix to get markets going very well. And I mean, let me quickly go through these 4 theses. The decision to open the bus market in Germany was a very, very small decision. It was highly debated, but it was at the end a small change in the law, a very small change. At the end, it was kind of taking away the veto power of Deutsche Bahn to block bus lines in Germany. So not of global relevance, you could say. What happened out of that is there was intense competition for this new market. We created a new market segment in long distance with a lot of companies competing for that, and it became a European movement. Markets in France were deregulated from Macron, so the buses in France still are called Car Macron. And so it was one of his big changes he did in the, as back then prior to his presidency. Markets in Italy got deregulated. Other countries started thinking about that. And there was a unification to a large extent of the European market because Germany was missing. The centerpiece in mobility, long distance, was missing. And then France and Italy followed, and markets that have been deregulated, UK, the Nordics, and Eastern Europe, they could be connected, and there was built a real European system. So a small, very technical decision in Germany triggered a European new market segment, innovation, digitalization, and benefit for the society. And you said it, we are now also very present in the US. We acquired Greyhound. And this is out of the one single small decision. So I would say we shouldn't underestimate the power of shaping the right market conditions, even if it's feeling like a small step. And we should be encouraged to do all these small steps. On the 2 other points, I think when we started this, there was extremely tough competition because the entry barriers in the long-distance bus piece are very, very small. And I mean, sounds strange, but I mean, if you buy a couple of buses, apply for a concession, you can start literally in 3 to 6 months, fully operational from the idea today to a bus network on the street. And we see this all the time. There's a new competitor in Italy, there's a new competitor in Germany, and so on. So the entry barriers have been very small. There was a market to grab. So a lot of companies ran into that market. And that was very different from what happened, for example, in the rail liberalization in the mid-90s, or the airline liberalization in the 90s. It took quite a long time for the market to accept the new regulatory framework and get into it. Bus in this long-distance space was very quickly set up by different companies, different type of companies, startups, like we were one, a couple of them, but many, many large corporates. Obviously, all state rail opened a bus company in all markets that get deregulated. And then there was Post and ADAC, and like every larger conglomerate looked at the market because it looked interesting. And obviously, I never got the idea what like postal service, how they are connected to long-distance buses and why that makes sense. But luckily enough, many realized that if it's not what you're really good at, you won't be successful. And this is, I think, an interesting learning out of that, because our competitors, by definition, have unlimited resources. Unlimited. It's in large extent taxpayers' money, and we did a rough calculation of the European landscape. We believe that state-owned companies lost €500 million in total across all markets, trying to prevent Flix from building up what we built today. And the money is completely gone, so most of the companies are either sold to others or shut down. Why? Because they were defending their market segment, in many ways state rail. So at the end, we did not win because we had a lot of money. Yes, we needed some money to survive the competition at the beginning, but our competitors had like endless resources. So why did we win? I believe we won because we focused on the consumer interest at the only paradigm that we looked at. And we do this with innovation and technology. We always thought first from the consumer, and we thought how to solve it with technology. We never came from an operator angle first, or from this is our historical market, how should we do it? We always thought from the consumer. And I think this shows very nicely that if you create a good level playing field, you can foster innovation and not necessarily the big incumbents win. You can make, in a fair competition, the small companies can win and build new markets. And therefore, I'm very happy that we are standing here today in a very intense competition still all across the world. And we also did a lot of mergers and cooperations with other companies. And obviously, my first contact with the Bundeskartellamt was 1.5 years after start of operations. And that's even more absurd if you look at the timescale that this is 10 years after start of operations, that our first visit to the Bundeskartellamt was less than 2 years after starting the company, because we merged with a competitor in the long-distance space. And I mean, there's a buzzword out there that says it's a killer, the killer acquisition. I just want to make clear, from a perspective, a stronger bus player was necessary to survive in the competition with state rail all over Europe. And therefore, this was the only way to make it a functioning market and at the end create real competition on the long run. And obviously, there are debates if this should have checked by the Bundeskartellamt or not. I'm very convinced it should have not checked, as it was then concluded. But I think it was a good discussion, and even being on, like you said, Mr. Mundt, on both sides of the table, I think it's a very positive thing to have that in mind, how you act, how you build the company, how you see competition. And I mean, many big corporates, they see competition as something bad, something disturbing their perceived historical right. We don't see that way. And I'm not saying that just because I'm here. I'm saying that every day to my employees. We are born out of competition. We are competing across the world with, I don't know, 50 to 100 companies every day. We have to fight for the consumer every day. And this is how we think we innovate. And this is also what drives others forward. So I truly believe that if you use the power of innovation, you can create something that helps on the path towards sustainable mobility in our space without having a lot of state funding for that, if you provide a fair market and the necessary infrastructure for that. And all in all, I would say the deregulation that happened was a great success in that market segment. So I'm truly convinced of that, and that's a very natural thing if you're standing here representing a large player in that market that you think was a great success, so I think that's not a big surprise. But an interesting effect that we saw is it really impacted other markets. And it impacted them a lot, and it impacted, most importantly, the joint market with long-distance rail. And I think the opening of the bus market did more to improve the state rail services than 30 years of Bahnreform and political pressure did before. And I know that's, if you dispute with the Deutsche Bahn, I'm not sure if anyone is here from Deutsche Bahn, would be relatively natural to be here. You might disagree, but I must openly say, if I would today compete with Deutsche Bahn from 10 years ago, I would be a very, very happy man, because it would be very easy, because they were lazy. They were not thinking about the consumer. They were thinking about, this is my historical right. I fight the deregulation of the bus market. That's what I'm supposed to do. I would say, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. What are you supposed to do is go out and fight for the consumer. Deliver a good product. Yeah? Do it on fair terms. And then you innovate, and then you bring value to society. So I truly believe that regulatory barriers or any barriers, infrastructure, physical, digital, are not your right. This is something that prevents competition. And we see it in different shades and forms. This is not only about Deutsche Bahn, and come to a couple of examples there. So on the one hand, I think we did a benefit through the competition with long-distance rail without stealing passengers. Already the term is absurd. I'm not stealing passengers. I'm offering them an alternative product. And if they choose that, you should think about your product and not about me disturbing you. But also, it enabled us to build up long-distance rail. Why? And the story is, long-distance rail is, and I said that from day one, that we think this integrated, and it's not against rail versus bus, even if we compete on a daily basis. It's us as public transport on long distances. We have to create a strong offer to get car users into our system. And this is, for example, my first business plan that I wrote. And I mean, you do that in Excel, and then at the end, you're right or wrong, you don't know. But what you strategically do should be already there. In our first business plan, Flix Train was part of the development of Flix. So we always saw the two markets as one, where we fight for the consumer, and therefore our expansion, we are now running Flix Trains in Germany and in Sweden. And we have a very European ambition on that, because we think there is a European market for rail, and at the end, this is something where we see, on the one hand, the competition, the intense daily competition between bus and rail, and on the other hand, that if we have a combined offer, that we have something attractive as a long-distance product and a long-distance market that can compete with car and airlines. So the markets are pretty much overlapping. And I give you one other example on Sweden. There's a lot of debate on on the sustainability path on low-cost carriers and how they can be substituted and so on, and about how you do it regulatory-wise. And there are things to do. But for example, we run a train between Stockholm and Gothenburg. It's less than 4 hours. And Ryanair opened a hub at about the same time in Stockholm to fly to Gothenburg. And our ambition is we take on the competition, and we will make them shut down. That's my ambition. And it will take time. And they will allocate the planes somewhere else where they make money. But this is our ambition, that our product has to be so good in terms of quality, price, and time, that I make it for consumers easy to switch to Flix Train. And it's 2 other competitors on that rail track, that we can avoid these flights. And it's not against Ryanair, so they can fly to Mallorca or whatever they do, but they should not be flying Stockholm-Gothenburg, because I think we have a fair chance to win there with our product. But nevertheless, it's, from my perspective, not all good out there, because we still have in many ways an outdated regulatory framework that has not been adapted to the changed markets. And we see a lot of politicians favoring monopolies, favoring especially state rail, but in many markets also tender bus services, which at the end prohibits competition, weakens the product, and decreases value for society. And therefore, and I'm very often saying that because essentially we're competing in all markets with state-owned players and with private players across the globe, that I'm extremely grateful that we have, and I stay with the European example, where with the most experience, strong referees. And this is our only chance. If we have strong referees to build a mobility system in the future that really adds value to society, and this can be, in some extent, the European Commission, that can be antitrust authorities, competition authorities all over the states. And we are not scared of the dialogue. We are open. We want to show how we work, how we think about the market, but we also want to make clear where there are shortcomings. And give you some examples. There is different VAT for long-distance buses and long-distance trains in Germany. Makes no sense at all. There's no logical explanation. The explanation that was in the law is essentially challenged by the own legal service of the government back then. And what we can do is, I talk to a lot of people and explain to them. And at the end, no one listens, because they say, yeah, but you have to understand, Deutsche Bahn is our company. This is what I get as a statement from politicians. And I think this is absurd. That's technically, first of all, it's technically wrong. It's not your company. You're representing the government and the people of this country. And on the other hand, that shouldn't be your concern, because your concern should be create a fair market. But what we do is we go to the European Commission, because that's the only way how we can challenge something like that if your counterparty is essentially the state. And we hope that we have success here. And obviously another tricky part, and I stumble over that a lot, is the combination of infrastructure might be physical and digital with the operators. That's a huge problem, and it's not fully properly solved in many markets. There are markets that are doing it very well. Sweden, where we run train services, they're doing it pretty well. It's done pretty bad in Germany and France, for example. I mean, and using, for example, track access charges as an effective barrier to entry, that's so obvious. I mean, very few countries do it in the extreme amount that France and Germany are doing it. But I mean, that's why you have 99% market share pre-Flix in Germany, and you still have 100% market share in France. It's a very clever way to do, and it's not that easy, as I said, not the easy, blunt deregulation where you say, hey, the markets are open, rail markets open, please run rail services in France. I say, no, the incumbent found a very, very clever way how to prevent competition. And the same is doing Deutsche Bahn in Germany. And there are other examples. For example, in Spain and Greece, the bus market is not open. It's the only segment of long-distance mobility that is closed. Yeah? Airlines open, trains open, bus markets, tendered business to incumbent companies, having huge monopoly returns, delivering a shitty product out there, and the consumers pay a higher price. And the last aspect, it's a small one, and we gave a big folder of like a couple of 100 pages to the Ministry of Transport and Digitalization in Germany, which is a nice combination because the folder is an application for a long-distance bus line. It takes you, in a best case, 6 months, a couple of 100 pages, including vet signatures, which you have to carry on your bus, which are from like the smallest jurisdiction in, above city level, so a Kreis. So there's some people doing a stamp on that, takes 6 months, and at the end you always get the license because it's an open market. But it prevents competition because, and in this case I could say it favors me because I'm already present in the market, but I think it's still a stupid barrier to entry. And to give you a very concrete example, which hurts me a bit, is we are doing a lot of services in Ukraine. We did it pre-war, covering the Ukraine, domestic and cross-border. Obviously, we shut down relevant parts of our network when the war started. We always operated in Lviv and brought refugees to Western Europe, and it's good to say that they're now going back. So the transport streams are balanced. People are also going back. And we reopened service to Kiev a couple of weeks ago. And I'm very grateful and proud that the drivers, Ukrainians, say, no, we want to provide service for the society in our country, and we go there, and it's strange if you discuss that you can't go by night because there might be bombings, and so it's a super strange world. We would like to run Berlin-Kiev. An application process from the Ukraine to Germany takes 2 years. And all the authorities take the maximum allowed time until they look at your paper. And there is no shortcut, and I'm not complaining about this one concession. It just shows that the one who has a concession now, just because he did it 15 years ago, now has a monopoly to Berlin and charging extremely high prices. Yeah? I don't get why this is the case. I actually don't get it. And that hurts me because I think this shows all these small pieces, how you can distract markets and disrupt competition, sometimes intended and sometimes unintended. So I think there is a lot of work to do. And a last point I want to mention, and because it was a very recent decision by the Bundeskartellamt, is the market dominant position of Bahn.de and the DB Navigator, so distribution channel of the state rail. And I think it's fair to take a look at digital infrastructure or digital platforms as gatekeepers. I think that's extremely important, and we are very thankful that this is now deeper looked at. And I'm fully aware that you look at the whole market, and I'm not hiding anything. And I think it's a good step, and yes, to stay on that example, we have the distribution of DB channels is more than 90% of rail services, and they have the ambition to be the one distributor for rail services, and they sell every rail service in Germany except one, Flix train. Why? Because they see us as competition, and the rest they have sorted out. And I think that's a perspective you can take as a company. I think I'm a big fan of competition, so I don't think I should take that perspective, but I think it's a fair conclusion. But what we should not do is accept that as a society And this is only one element, and I think it's a lot of these things, to create a real level playing field. Because at the end, if you want to reach sustainable mobility, I'm totally convinced that it is possible, and we need to spend money on that as governments, but we should invest it in the right things. And an open market for innovation and digital solution comes for free and creates welfare and society benefits. It doesn't cost a lot of money. So when I talk also to politicians who like to announce the big flagship things where they solve something, where they write a big check on like a chip factory or whatever, I tell them, please don't forget that you have to do the hard work every day. And you're not fixing a problem at the end. This is not fixing. This is covering the pain. What you should do is fix the markets and decide how markets should function. And this is not where you get the big headline or the big applause. This is the tough work you have to do on every day. And I encourage and demand that from politicians to look into that, and not only for the headline and the big check, how they fixed digitalization, fixed mobility or energy generation. So I brought some perspectives to say, what do we want in the future? I think mobility is very often seen from a top-down perspective, but I think removing these gatekeeper and barriers is essential and will bring a lot of value to society. We obviously, and you see that we have the best example, train and bus markets are connected in one market because we compete for the same purpose, for the same passenger, and passengers swap between the modes of transport. And there is extremely fierce competition out there. And that's not a complaint. I mean, that's the way it is. And I can't build a company out of an open market and deregulation and then complain about competition. That's the way it goes, and therefore we want and have to live with it, and we have to innovate for the decades to come, otherwise we have no role there. And it's to make that clear. For example, if my team asks me to which country do we go next, and what is the important justification to go in a country, on the one hand, I need a regulatory environment, first thing, and that's, as it's the main criteria, it's a little bit absurd, because it shouldn't be the criteria. There should be open market. But what I also say is we have to bring value to the market. We have to have the feeling that we as a company can create value for the consumer and for the society. If not, then we have no right to win, and then we should not be in that market. I want to stress the point on infrastructure, both physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure, that this is a key parameter to create open markets, and it's leveraged and used by intent or unintentionally to prevent competition. And what we also see, and where we also are in discussion with competition authorities on European and national level, is obviously that price setting by state-controlled or subsidized players is the biggest lever that they have to prevent competition and to distort competition. Therefore, there needs a lot of focus on that. My closing remark, I think the mobility of the future is the most exciting times ever, and it will be very, very challenging for everyone who runs scheduled long-distance services, and that involves the SNCF, the DB, us, and everyone else out there. We have to turn to sustainability, full carbon neutrality. There will be autonomous cars, air taxis, whatever. The world will change in mobility, but I believe in the future of collective transport. I believe in the power of many people sharing one mode of transport. Buses and trains can be the mean of transport of the 21st century everywhere in the world, but we must treat and regulate them like in the 21st century and not accept the monopolies of the mindset of the 20th century. And we need to finalize the European open market, remove barriers for competition, and this is also my call to action to the people in this room. For all of this, antitrust cartel offices play a crucial role. You have to ensure the level playing field, because we can't do it alone. We need you as a referee, and that means not always judging in our favor, but this means being the independent, looking at the level playing field. And if this can be done and you play your role well, I think we hold a promising future for shared mobility and collective mobility, and that our industry will successfully transform towards sustainability and benefit of the society. But we are aware of the crucial role that you all play. So thanks a lot for being here. It's a great honor. And I'm not sure if I now stole too much of the coffee break.
No, don't worry, Mr. Schwämmlein, it's all fine. Well, you talked about concessions that take 2 years. You know that in the Bundeskartellamt, sometimes you get a clearance for a merger within 24 hours. I doubt a little bit that an acquisition by Flix would take only 24 hours. So, but that's another question. We could
try not to come with another acquisition in Germany to you.
That's fine. I hear that. No, but maybe one question, because we are already over time. I mean, you are in a business that is extremely important for environmental development in Europe, all over the world. So is there something that we as antitrust authorities, that we can do in order to foster this environmental advantage that your companies, that your activities in the mobility sector has? Do we have a role there?
I absolutely believe that it's a very crucial role, because what you see is that at the end it will be solved with innovation accompanied by a clear regulatory environment, which also the Minister and Sven Giegold mentioned. But I think what we need is that we need the space for innovation, and this can only happen if there's a market which is open and fair to compete in, because otherwise the investments that should go into sustainability will be, from our perspective, wrongly directed. And what we do at the moment is we invest heavily in e-buses, fuel cell pilot projects, etc., because we think this will be a competitive advantage in the future and a competitive necessity. So this is, I think, at the end comes back to the origin of what you're doing. Ensuring fair competition will, with a clear guidance from politicians, lead to this sustainable transformation. But you have this big enabler role from my perspective.
Okay. Mr. Schwämmlein, we are already over our time. Thank you very much for these insights in this extremely interesting branch for the time being. This takes us to the coffee break. We won't take you too long. 15 minutes, good luck. And we meet in this room for our panel. Many thanks.
Thank you.